Wednesday. And we're going to start out with Hadas, and take it away.
Thank you. This, the title of this is De-sacralizing the Liberal Conception of Money. And I will, hopefully that will be a little bit clearer by the end of this. It presents a relatively small part of a very large intellectual project. What I'm trying to do is create a new paradigm, popular word, for understanding the economy. The ultimate goal is to integrate economic activity into a realistic understanding of human nature and society. In other words, what I want to do is present a genuine homo economicus. This is the person homo who strives for virtue and transcendental excellence while being susceptible to sin. A person who lives in communities and societies in which there is both harmony and discord. To place this person in the economy as it really is, to make him or her economicus, I have first to clear up some intellectual rubble, to discredit several collections of pervasive misunderstandings about economic matters. The confusions about the nature of money, which is my topic today, are both prominent and typical. I should start by framing this a little more, which is to say that critics of modernity generally hate money. Some of them, often drawing on the ideas articulated by the young Marx, describe the modern reliance on money as something like substance abuse. Money is a drug which leads to personal and social alienation. It dissolves traditions, it debases the notion of value, and reduces everything noble to an arbitrary number. If you add some more dogmatic economic Marxists and their fellow travelers, they say that money is a crucial weapon in modern class warfare, which of course they identify as one of the central themes or the central theme of modern society. There's another more positive view. Enthusiasts for money, and especially for the modern economy, see money as both good and crucial. It is good because it objectively measures the values of whatever needs to be valued objectively, or possibly it subjectively measures the value of whatever needs to be measured subjectively, but with nice numbers. And it is crucial because it stores those numerical values and moves them smoothly and neatly over time and space. There are even what you might call money groupies, people who postulate a sort of monetary physics in which impersonal market forces, expressed in monetary terms, not only set monetary values, but actually make all important economic choices untouched, as it were, by human rationality. These two groups of thinkers are violently opposed to each other in many ways. However, they agree that money is at the center of the modern economy, and that it plays a significant role in shaping the broader society and culture. I'm here to tell you that that's wrong. In the economy, the money of everyday earning and spending is nothing worse or better than useful. In the society and culture, this money is almost nothing. It is neither sinister nor solid, neither especially alienating nor anything like an objective quantitative standard of value. It basically is what Heidegger says that technology is not. That is, it is a neutral tool. This monetary claim is dull. It is ambitiously dull, I like to think. However, it is subject to a serious qualification. What I am calling money is neutral, but there are other things which are not neutral that go by the same name. In philosophical terms, the word money is used equivocally. That is, it refers to several conceptually distinct things. The distinctions are genuine, but they are often easy to miss, since a particular piece of money, a $10 bill or $1,000 in the bank, can easily move from one of my categories of money to another. I identify three of these categories. The kind I'm talking about today, for almost the entire presentation, is a numerical token of something in the economy, so I call it imaginatively token money. At the end of this paper, I will briefly mention the two other categories, treasure money and symbol money. They are both more exciting and more culturally significant than token money, so try not to fall asleep before I get to them. What is token money? It is a token in the great exchange. And what is the great exchange? That is the key to my whole analysis of the economy. This great exchange describes what economic activity actually is at the deepest anthropological or ontological level. This is the basic economic exchange, and it goes like this. In one direction, there are people who offer their labor as a gift to humanize the world. In the other direction, there is the humanized world which gives its gifts to people. These gifts, these fruits of human labor, are consumption goods and services. Now, there's a lot to be said about this great exchange of labor and consumption. I might want to start with a defense of my use of the broad and vague word of gifts to the world and from the world to describe the flow of labor and consumption, instead of what economists usually talk about, which would be transactions and contracts. My topic today, money, is related to that disputed description, but it is much narrower. Now, what does money do? In a way, the role is obvious. Monetary exchanges, paying wages or prices, mirror or mediate the great exchange. Money is used to pay the wages of labor, and it pays the prices of consumption goods and services. But why? Why do people create and use this intermediary token? Why could they not simply consume and labor without paying or being paid? And also, what does it do? What effect? What does the use of money actually do to the human-world relationship that makes up the economy, and to the whole society and culture in which the economy is always embedded? There are three monetary observations that will help answer the question. The first is that the great exchange does not require money. Indeed, economies made very limited use of token money before the industrial age. Even today, most of the labor performed at home remains money-free. Neither parents nor children put a monetary price on the food and cuddles that they share or give away. The second observation is that there is something unnatural, something artificial and arbitrary about money. This comes way back to Aristotle, who pointed out that money creates a commensurability which the things that money pays for do not naturally have. We cannot provide numbers that meaningfully express, say, an hour of threshing labor, talking pre-industrial, in terms of an hour spent feeding a baby or writing software to move it up to date. Such cross-category comparisons, when they produce ratios, prices, or numbers, this time threshing is worth so many minutes of nursing or so many lines of software. These numbers are nothing more than disrespectful fictions. Disrespectful because people aren't numerical. You can't count human categories. The final observation is that money is amazingly useful. This malleable fiction allows each person's wages to be converted into many different baskets of consumption goods and services: clothes, lipstick, chairs, whatever, houses, transport, and allows the price of each good and service to be converted back into a tiny part of the wages of numerous, widely dispersed laborers, everyone at the lipstick factory, the clothes factory, the transport system. It would take me a long time to describe all the wonderful, helpful things that money facilitates. But that long analysis leads to a simple conclusion. The more complex the economy, that is, the more specialized the laborers, the more intricate the chains of production, the more useful money will be in the great exchange for that economy. So guided by these three observations, that money is optional, that it's unnatural, and that it's amazingly useful, I can answer the why question. Why do we use money? We use it because it helps organize labor and consumption. And we use it when a numerical placeholder, however artificial, can usefully help in arranging the inherently non-numerical part of the human condition, this inherently non-numerical part. So that also gives us a hint about the answer to the what question. What does money do? Token money, here's the dull part, does not do much, either to the economy or to society. There's nothing omnipotent about it, nothing ineluctable about its logic. It's human decisions that control the total amount of money in circulation. It's human decisions that set all individual prices and wages. There is nothing deeply meaningful about those prices and wages. Those money numbers have relations to objective and subjective factors, labor power, and so forth, scarcity. But those connections are all muddled and indirect. Money has no moral qualities. It's not good or bad, token money. Nor is this token money in any way wise. The money groupies are all wrong. Wages and prices don't make judgments about factories or workers or pollution levels. People make those decisions. They may make use of monetary information, but they cannot delegate their economic responsibility to some impersonal and largely fictional world of wages and prices. So the critics of money have the wrong target. Token money is not responsible for any of the woes of modern society. Money is not at the center of capitalism. It does not clearly pollute human relations. Indeed, money, which has replaced other forms of human relations in the economy, its money is not obviously more alienating than, say, feudal obligations or slavery. Money does not need to be used when it is judged to be inappropriate, and we do judge it to be inappropriate. In developed economies, many important types of consumption have been removed from the monetary economy. People receive without paying for emergency services, police, fire, for primary and secondary education, and in civilized countries for tertiary education and for most of their health care. So we don't need to use money and we don't want to. We can work without it in the economy. So such examples cast really severe doubt on the deep criticisms of money. They also embarrass the enthusiasts who think money is always desirable and helpful scale of value. In reality, people often do not want their labor and consumption to be measured on a monetary scale. In reality, wages and prices are influenced by too many shifting forces to be precise indicators of anything non-monetary. The euro is worth a euro, but that's about as far as it goes in value. I can understand, though, why money is often treated as a sort of sacrament or an anti-sacrament of the secular age. Money has these odd characteristics. It's insubstantial, it's malleable, it has a concentrated power because it buys so many things. It has an apparent potential infinity because you can always have more of it. It gives it a kind of air of transcendence in our non-transcendental age. And its numerical nature, for those who don't like this age, seems to express something about the modern desire to look at each human and natural thing as something that essentially can be counted and precisely compared. But these appearances are deceptive. Token money is almost unbearably mundane. There's nothing sinister or wonderful in its spread. It's just loose. Now, briefly, I mentioned treasure money. It is quite different from token money. As the name implies, this type of money is something of value which is treasured, stored up, not circulated, not used for paying wages or prices. Traditionally, treasure money was held in treasuries, which held gold and jewels and shiny wonders. But we live in a mundane age. Today's treasure money is mostly intangible. Balances in bank accounts and financial assets, or tangible but very unglamorous land. Now, this treasure money really does deserve serious critical study. While token money is no more contrary to God than anything else in the created world, treasure money really does easily end up working for the unjust kingdom of mammon. For example, high land prices reinforce economic social inequality in both neighborhoods and countries. There's more to be said, much more about that. But I just want to close with the final type of money, symbol money. And it is by far the most interesting, that's why I saved it for last, because money has such a, what Charles Taylor calls a rich imaginary. It's symbolic vocabulary. I have 21 examples in the book I'm writing, but I'll give you just a few. It includes greed, you can think of Midas, generosity, think of Aristotle's virtue of magnanimity, power, Marx, when I mentioned, liberation, think neoliberal politics, you think money is liberating, community, think of the political unity of the Europe expressed in the monetary euro. And all this symbolism is truly fascinating. But what I want to say today is that it's basically irrelevant to the great exchange. It may influence our thoughts, but it's not really relevant to the reality of what we're doing in the economy. In today's economy, most money is token money, it's mundane, and does not deserve any metaphysical awe. Send it to the engineers. Now, I can't quite explain why so many observers of modernity are fixated on money. I gave you some hints. But it's bad because they often ignore features which are much more significant to the modern economic experience. For example, the new idea of employment relationships, bureaucratic structures, regulatory arrangements. and for the technological developments and choices. But I'll continue to ponder the monetary obsession. As I mentioned, I'm writing a book on it. But what I can say with certainty now is that money receives much more economic attention than it deserves, much more sociological attention than it deserves, token money does. To understand the economy, the great exchange, and to make it a better servant of the common good, money should be kept in its appropriate, modest place.
Thank you. Next we have Martin Hoványi.
When I submitted the abstract of this paper at the end of September 2018, Hungary was already in a bad situation, but not as bad as now, when I'm delivering this talk. In the time since September 2018, then, in the past 4.5 months, the Hungarian legislation forced our only university with real international success, the Central European University, to move. In addition, a part of the judicial powers was subordinated to the legislative powers. The tendentious concentration of power in the media has increased realistically and symbolically, and finally, the Hungarian government has started to liquidate the whole network of research institutions of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, founded in the 19th century as the intellectual pioneer of Hungarian national sovereignty, following the same method it had once successfully employed in the case of the Central European University. What common factor in these four changes do I consider to be the most important ones? All four serve to mute critical utterances. The question arises, why do we not hear a prophetic critical voice from Christian denominations, or rather from Christian theology? The organized silence of Christianity in Hungary is a symbiosis in the system. As a Catholic theologian from Hungary, I seek to understand this sixth symbiosis within the system in the first part of my talk, in order to put the following questions in the second part, moving away from the specific example of Hungary. In the place of curative theology can be established such an authentic theology that can function as a contemporary critical theory. Thus, the first question is, what is happening in Central Eastern Europe at present, especially in Hungary? In order to understand the almost unhindered advancement of populism, we have to take into account at least three historical precedents: the Reformation, the European Enlightenment, and the unprocessed traumas caused by the 20th century right and left-wing dictatorships. We should discuss these topics in their own complexity, individually, in the case of each country, but for our purpose, it might be enough to focus on the fact that the Eastern European reception of all three historical changes, or the lack of it, is related to the nature of Christian theological practice and the relationship of Christian denominations to the state. In short, to the duality of authority and freedom. Poland, for instance, could fight for its own autonomy against Soviet communism, with a more preserving social collaboration than Hungary, the peak of which was the Solidarity movement. In turn, Poland, according to Hanskin, could not reap the fruits of the Reformation or the European Enlightenment. Hungary was more successful primarily in the reception of the 16th century Reformation. In addition, through a narrower intellectual circle, Hungarian versions of the Enlightenment could also take root. The outstanding and at the same time, in many respects unfortunately singular intention of resistance of the 1956 revolution proved to be, through the eyes of the present, understandably not enough compared to the 40-year-long communist dictatorship. Hungarian society, like many other societies belonging to the post-Soviet bloc, began rebuilding a modern democracy at the end of the 20th century in an enervated way. As far as I am concerned, out of many circumstances, the most important psychological deficit was caused by the fact that we have not faced the past at the expense of our democratic aspirations, which started 30 years ago. We are still not aware who the collaborators were from the Hungarian political elite, or to what extent that they collaborated during the years of the communist dictatorship. The secret lists of agents may make research work impossible for our historians. Thus, disclosure is not available for us, which would make us face the past, and through the crisis could lead us to catharsis. The little and fragmented data that still is available for us reflects a very grave picture. There is hardly any family and hardly any small religious community that could stay free from the system of spies. It may not be necessary to elaborate how much this ruined the web of trust in the society. The authenticity of churches and their relations to politics are especially sensitive areas in this question, since the church is functioning for a long time as a last resort of opposition, have been corrupted throughout the decades by gradual and strong recruitment work. It is important to note at this point, without blaming anyone personally, that 1/3 of the active members of the Hungarian Catholic Bishops' Conference were born in 1950 or earlier, that is, at the dawn of the communist dictatorship. They had socialized when they studied theology as seminarians in an environment and historical situation that was characterized by the lack of trust, spying, and the terror of punishing orders. Since after the transition, even the Hungarian Catholic Church has not faced the problems, possibilities of renewal are also limited. Stories of unrevealed collaborations and incurable wounds of trust implicitly organize the presentation of the Church. It is fundamentally important to realize all this if we intend to understand why, for example, the practice of Catholic theology, which can possibly take place in Hungary at universities exclusively affiliated to the Church, is blind in its training curriculums to 20th century and contemporary critical theories, especially if they are left-wing and have political consequences. The blind spot of theological courses, together with the traumatized loss of trust in an institutional level, is responsible for the fact that there is hardly any theological research in Hungary. Moreover, only a weak selection of international research results reaches Christian intellectuals through translations. The same phenomenon is also behind the fact that the presently governing party had been firmly rejected by the leaders and members of the Hungarian Catholic Church due to its liberal attitude 30 years ago, and that they warmly welcomed later the same party as conservatives, and since 2014, so-called illiberal term of the party taking place since that time. This ominous illiberal term was announced by Viktor Orbán on the 25th of July in 2014 in his famous Transylvanian speech. Ferenc Zakaria, who was the first to discuss the notion of illiberal democracy in 1997 on the pages of Foreign Affairs, reacted to the speech on the columns of Washington Post in the following: I never imagined that a national leader from Europe, no less, would use the term as a badge of honor. End quote. In the following part of the reaction, faithfully to its title, The Rise of Putinism, Ferenc compares the conceptions of the Hungarian leader to Vladimir Putin's Russian governing technique. In light of the above, there is no need to elaborate how easy it is to find points of connection between the present Russian government and the Hungarian conception of government stuck in the trauma of the Iron Curtain. In Russia, the relationship between the Orthodox Church and the state is still characterized by a few significant features of Caesaropatism. Being familiar with the Hungarian ambitions of foreign policy and external economy, at this point we have reached today's conception of populist structures of loyal and subordinated to the churches. We also saw examples for open agitations in the church after our liturgy in Hungary. The strong relationship between the political elite, also naming themselves as conservative with leaders of the church, features another recurring motif from a theological point of view, not mentioned before: the popularity of Mariological questions. This is in connection with the fact that these national churches, with their zealous cult of Mary and the frequent practice of prayer liturgy, are significantly different from the order of service in other countries. It would be worthwhile to examine once, through the statistics of publications, that in countries of either South America or Europe or other continents, where the political system is a hybrid democratic or totalitarian dictatorship, how much more often theologians have written about Saint Mary or angelology, for example. I cannot prove it yet, but according to my hypothesis, the more centralized a political culture is and the more loyal the local Catholic Church is to the governing system, the more particular the examined theological topics are. In any case, examples for the interrelation between the cult of Mary and conservatism are the files of the Second Vatican Council, which proved that among the debating bishops, members of the conservative wing were dedicated to supporting the Church to name the Holy Virgin as co-savior in the level of the Mass. Since the present government offers great material support for the voting base of the Church, it can count on the support of the churches. This support increases at the time of elections. Between the elections, leaders of the Church advocate measures compatible with the moral teachings of the Church with open communication, and problematic measures, for example, the question of migration or the corruption, with sheer silence. My answer to the question put at the beginning of my talk is this: why is the Church silent when it should let its prophetic voice be heard, seeing the measures of the government? This phenomenon is symbolically sealed by the name Christian Democratic Party, a member of the party alliance forming the government in Hungary. This party is a political force that cannot be measured on its own. The larger governing party, namely Hadas, has helped them in order that, identifying with their name and values, they could hold them up as an ideological shield. It may be clear from all this why the relationship between the secular state and the Church in Hungary could be described by the attributive phrase political Christianity appearing in the title of my paper. From the historical concentration of the state and Church, this contemporary political Christianity in Hungary is the spiritual heir of the activity of Theodosius the Great, Justinian the Great, and John Calvin. Now, I have to go to Calvin. Calvin, as a lawyer, reorganized the public administration, education, and most of all the religious life of Geneva, and arranged the political and religious life of the Reformed city-state already according to the norms of the European modern era. The Prime Minister of Hungary is a member of the denomination founded by Calvin, who had strict morals and outstanding educations, according to Calvin. Between 2012 and 2018, Viktor Orbán appointed Zoltán Balogh as the head of the Supreme Minister responsible for the complete education, culture, and healthcare, who is not only a Calvinist clergyman, but has also been the personal spiritual leader of Viktor Orbán for long years. To balance the Calvinist denomination, the Prime Minister ensured a Deputy Prime Minister position responsible for national policy for the leader of the Christian Democratic Party, who happens to be a Catholic theologian. Therefore, Hungary is in a special but unfortunately not in a unique situation. According to the theological adequate definition of Christianity, primarily Christ should be followed. This supposes the disciple, servant role of Christians in the case of everyone, including the leaders, which undertakes to follow the obedient example of Christ. When in political Christianity, the leaders keep theology and the Church in a position subordinated to their own ambitions for power, they avoid the path of obedience in fact. In the second part of the paper, following the identification of the problem, we should first and foremost face it, or in the religious sense, confess it. So this, from the 20th century theological models, Karl Rahner's theory of structural sin seems the most appropriate. When the reality of political Christianity develops in Hungary or in other countries in different varieties, it is necessarily in a state which indicates not an individual, but a systemic sin. Populist leadership could not exist had it not been elected in a democratic or at least semi-democratic way. A considerable part of Hungarian voters have elected the formation of political Christianity for the third time. This becomes a structural sin since criticism formulated in the name of Christianity, however authentic, is undermined from the beginning by the fact that the whole political system declares to act with reference to Christianity. The church that had once already legitimized political Christianity by its support or silence has itself become part of the system. In the meantime, criticism of Christianity coming from outside can never be authentic enough compared to critical voice coming from within. If the Hungarians watch the recording of this talk, a significant part of the society will tag me as traitor or an anti-Christian theologian. I am convinced that when I apologize to you and before you for the sinful identifications, covering up, or acts of the Catholic Church, I am in fact practicing my profession or my vocation. After getting familiar with the facts according to our power, there is no other way to follow Christ but to apologize. Now I do apologize in the first place to you, and later more Christian people will apologize to everyone for the corruption of political Christianity, or, for example, the sexual abuses destroying the American Catholic Church. And unfortunately, we could continue this list. The characteristic of nature of structural sin is that as a member of the given social order, we cannot speak of individual innocence. The line of individual conversions is necessary for a converted church to fulfill its prophetic vocation again. This prophetic role, died for sin and resurrected for life, is something that theologians should make sure today to be a critical theory. This new initiation rite must be the living of our baptism, which brings a deeper commitment to Christian obedience. I use the simile of baptism on purpose. According to my hypothesis, every Christian denomination, including the Catholic Church in the first place, needs the reinterpretation of the Augustinian notion of original sin. It is a dogmatic necessity that at the transmission of the original sin, the medium should not be so-called concupiscence, because it would have unforeseeably grave consequences for our anthropology and moral theology. Instead of this, the theological task is all the more to describe the reality of the original sin with the relationships in the center, similar to the command of love, centering around relationships. This is why specifically the conception of Rahner thinking in terms of the structural sins of social relationships is a suitable starting point. If the original sin can indeed be redefined like this, the mechanism of salvation and grace can also become based on relationships. This is also more appropriate trinitologically and anthropologically, since it makes it possible to interpret salvation history as interactions between persons. The reception of grace can take place through an institutional and social cleansing created for the model of personal conversion and baptism. 3 theological starting points should be provided by the renewing theology built on the basis described above: the new methodological character, the eschatological approach to history, and the theoretical elaboration of the asceticism of spiritual age of majority. Firstly, the reason why it is necessary to carry out systematic research on the nature of the Holy Spirit, its presence in the world and its church leading activity, because only He can bring renewal and provide an appropriate understanding of ourselves even today. If we examine the date of pneumatological debates, it turns out that it always lifted the eras of great theological ignorance following the critical periods of church history. Secondly, history and the actual political system in it should again be observed in the light of eschatology. Referring to Márton Heidegger, forerunning to our own death is something that can give a proper place to the value given the activity of the day. I agree with Ratzinger, who warned us not to put every hope of ours into a specific political structure. And last, it is necessary for more theology to elaborate such principles that do not force the believers to take up the role of the children, but that help them to make decisions as adults, with a mature conscience in every respect. The political aspect of such a renewing theology that is based on relationships is only competent to become the critical theory of tomorrow. Thank you.
Okay, now Austin Kopack.
Good morning. I'm here primarily as a theologian and practicing in church context. So for me, this came out of very practical concerns of ministry. In his recent Cultural Liturgies trilogy, philosopher James K. Smith develops a pedagogy of desire in which he challenges intellectualist priorities in Christian education by arguing that it is not our thinking or feeling that is most basic for our human existence, but our habits. It is these which cultivate our loves and ultimately determine and explain our behaviors. Smith's notion of a Christian habitus and his Augustinian anthropology may be considered a theological complement to the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein. The social account of language proposed in the later Wittgenstein suggests that the meanings of concepts arise amongst pre-linguistic communal practices. If this is the case, then theological language cannot be abstracted from its concrete expressions of the world because its meaning is dependent upon a historically Christian form of life. As Wittgenstein puts it, the end is not certain propositions striking us immediately as true. That is, it's not a kind of seeing on our part, it is our acting, which lies at the bottom of the language game. Only as a Christian community engages in cruciform practices does Christian theology acquire its distinctive sense. Wittgenstein asks, how do I know that two people mean the same thing when each says he believes in God? Practice gives their words their sense. So in conjunction, Smith's Augustinian anthropology raises the stakes by characterizing all human practices, religious or otherwise, as teleological structures for desired formation. This paper explores his contribution of Wittgenstein to theology through Smith's liturgical project in order to address a prevalent disconnect between theology and practice in contemporary Western Christianity. I'll briefly examine some syncretistic tendencies that arise from competing forms of life in a pluralistic society, some important epistemic and anthropological shifts that are necessary, and the implications of these shifts for Christian pedagogy. So some competing forms of life, the problem. If it is actually our habits which precede our beliefs as foundational for who we are as humans, as Wittgenstein suggests, then we should not expect sound teaching alone to produce distinctive Christian people because we are constantly being subliminally socialized into an amalgam of alternative and competing forms of life. Consequently, there are U.S. Christians who sincerely espouse biblical doctrines, whilst simultaneously embodying practices of modern democratic liberalism that may be antithetical to those same beliefs. American sociologist Christian Smith argues that the contemporary plurality of practices and values in a modern liberal society results in competing and blended moral orders, such as a biblical tradition, a Republican tradition, utilitarian individualism, and expressive individualism, which bleed together into a Christian, capitalist, democratic, romanticist, libertarian, secular thing. He goes on to say that most people live their lives negotiating the demands of multiple religious and non-religious moral orders, compromising here, synthesizing there, compartmentalizing elsewhere. Hence, modern life looks more like a shifting kaleidoscope of these habituated loves than a chessboard of intellectual world beliefs, or worldviews. And the secular and sacred intertwine as all these practices cultivate ultimate allegiances. So there's no neutrality or distinctive private public spheres. Contrary to claims of secular neutrality, all of our, quote, social institutions are always morally animated enterprises. So that every embodied practice in which we engage is actually an enculturation that forms us towards some telos. And we can look at all sorts of cases here in America with religious right and rising nationalism. And I would argue you can see this kind of syncretistic tendency in two areas of behavior in American Christians. The first being money. So according to nonprofit source, despite New Testament admonitions against accumulating wealth and a lot of emphasis on radical generosity, we see in America that only 5% of Christians actually tithe, and of those, 80% only give 2% of their income, which, as you'll know, is not a tithe at all. This is down from 3.3% during the Great Depression. Now, perhaps the discipleship of American Christians is not outcompeting the formational practices of consumerism in a market-driven society. Even if it's preached well, the theology of grace embodied weekly in an active tithing might quickly be drowned out on Monday morning as parishioners re-enter the alleged public sphere with its competing web of value-laden practices. Whether it be a physical mall with its sensory enticements or the potentially more self-indulgent online marketplace with carefully tailored advertisements, all of our economic practices cultivate in us a commodification of our lives through a liturgy of consumption. And this is quoting James Smith here. He says, modern liberal democratic capitalism and the cultural ontology that floats it is now, through the process of globalization and marketing, colonizing most regions of the world and most aspects of our lives. End quote. These consumer exchanges then reinforce in us a disposition that our resources are private goods existing for our personal fulfillment. Human flourishing itself then becomes defined in terms of material abundance and financial self-sufficiency. Lest we think this is just an issue of private holiness or something like that, New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, he draws out some of the social implications of these allegiances. So he says, when human beings give their heartfelt allegiance to and worship that which is not God, they progressively cease to reflect the image of God. And he says, those who worship money increasingly define themselves in terms of it, and increasingly treat other people as creditors, debtors, partners, or customers, rather than as human beings. So these economic practices begin to affect all of the social relationships. Another area in which we see this is in regards to marital practices. So the Barna Group found that not only are divorce rates highest in the Bible Belt, conservative Protestant Christians on average have the highest divorce rates in the United States. Now there's some important confounding variables here. There's lower income in these parts of the country, fewer college graduates, people get married younger, and more people are getting married in general, so of course you're going to have more divorces. But at the same time, George Barna cautions too much skepticism here, because he says that of more than 70 other moral behaviors they study, when they compare Christians and non-Christians, they rarely find substantial differences. So whether we contribute this inconsistency to a failure of Christian education to produce a distinctive Christian way of life, or simply a false positive response bias for Christian self-identity, the perpetuation of Christianity as primarily a catalog of propositional beliefs or emotional experiences might contribute to this discontinuity. Similar to the act of tithing, contemporary Christian teaching on biblical marriage fails to compete with and may even reinforce cultural perceptions of marriage as primarily a romantic source of individual happiness. Rather than being an arena for sanctification and spiritual maturity, marriage becomes one more consumer product promising self-fulfillment. And didactic teaching alone is inadequate to counter the powerful lure of eroticism for a people little practiced in the disciplines of self-denial. In contrast, Wittgenstein's philosophy suggests that what it means to be religious is not simply to have a particular set of beliefs, a worldview, but to live within an integrated religious form of life held together by a whole web of communal practices. This does not degrade the more reflective and contemplative capacities of the human intellect, but it situates these capacities within a larger network of cultural traditions. This dependence of doctrinal beliefs upon daily behavior has often been overlooked in Western Christian education because the self-determining individual of the Enlightenment has continued on in the Western Christian ethos, providing us the illusion of a disintegrated autonomy in which people are primarily thinkers who choose their beliefs and actions through some rational or intuitive process of internal deliberation. James K. Smith concludes that any philosophical anthropology that fails to appreciate we are liturgical animals, and thus fails to appreciate the central role of practices in formation, will tend to either reduce Christianity to a belief system or an emotivist experience. A Christian education focused on simply teaching theological truths may succeed in cultivating Christian minds, yet fail to shape the deeper narratives, the social imaginaries, bound up in the rest of life, stopping short of actually transforming the whole person by reshaping the object of their loves and reorienting the telos of their habits towards a Christian vision of the common good. So this social embodiment of knowledge. So in contrast to such a reductive anthropology, Wittgenstein offers a picture of human knowledge and belief that is not grounded in other ideas or beliefs, but arises amidst the most basic pre-linguistic interactions. He says, language, I want to say, is a refinement. Quoting Faust, he says, in the beginning was the deed. So drawing upon language acquisition, he says, the child, I should like to say, learns to react in such and such a way, and in reacting doesn't so far know anything. Knowing only begins at a later level. So before learning abstract concepts, we must begin with shared recognizable patterns of behavior that convey basic judgments about the world, judgments which form our grammar. Wittgenstein invites us to imagine, what would it be like if human beings showed no outward signs of pain, didn't groan, grimace, etc.? Then it'd be impossible to teach a child the use of the word toothache. When one says, well, he gave a name to his sensation, one forgets that a great deal of stage setting in the language is presupposed if the mere act of naming is to make sense. So just something as simple as ostension requires socialized behavior. This is to say that everything we do inside our heads is already dependent on our inclusion in a historical community. Dominican priest Fergus Kerr summarizes, one is unable to get a hold of something independent of one's being initiated into certain common practices. The only a priori is Lebensform. Applying this to theology, he says that we do not know what doctrine means unless we can see how it is enfleshed in human life. Similarly, Anthony Thistleton explains, concepts like being redeemed or being spoken to by God and so on are made intelligible and teachable not on the basis of private existential experience, but on the basis of a public tradition of certain patterns of behavior. This social particularity and historical situatedness required for our conceptual acquisition, and thus any doctrinal transmission, pushes back on appeals to universal reason and natural theology. Hence, pragmatist conclusion that we as humans are contingent creatures. As Alistair McIntyre argues in his book, Dependent Rational Animals, our materiality is something we share with intelligent pre-linguistic social animals. Human identity, he says, is primarily, even if not only, bodily, and therefore animal identity. And it is by reference to that identity that the continuities of our relationship to others are partly defined. He says that adult human activity and belief are best understood as developing out of, and as still in part dependent upon, modes of belief and activity that we share with some other species of intelligent animal. So that our whole initial bodily comportment towards the world is originally an animal comportment. This has been recently corroborated by research in cognitive science, where the emerging movement of embodied cognition argues that cognition depends upon the kinds of experience that comes from having a body with various sensory motor capacities. And second, these individual sensory motor capacities are themselves embedded in a more encompassing biological, psychological, and cultural context. The contingency of this anthropology does justice to our human finitude and cleans up some of the confusion around the nature of religious belief by calling into question the entire notion of a private individual. As McIntyre concludes, the vocabulary in which I make intelligible and justify, or fail to justify, my actions and beliefs within a network of relationships of giving and receiving is never merely mine. It is ours, always ours, a set of shared expressions put to shared uses embedded in a wide range of common practices of receiving and giving in a common form of life. Further pushing back on intellectualist approaches to religion, Wittgenstein claims that faith is simply a thing we do. Only in the myth of a mental process does the believer doubt whether or not he has it. So believing in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, for example, is not a private experience, but an oriented culture Christians come to adopt through the recognizable patterns of faith in the lives of the faithful. This is evident, I think, in the challenge of the Apostle James. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. It's not a juxtaposition of two equally viable options, but a rejection of unobservable faith that's not only impossible, but simply absurd. Wittgenstein captures this understanding of faith when he says that believing is a kind of disposition of the believing person. This is shown to me in the case of someone else by his behavior. It is in the routines of generous giving, for example, that the grammar of God as creator and sustainer begins to make sense. It is only as we forgive those who sin against us that we can actually begin to understand what it means to be forgiven, and only then can we be said to have understood. The post-liberal ethicist Stanley Hauerwas says it this way. He says, the signs of authenticity of anyone's faith lie in their manner of living it out. This is not in some internal conviction that accompanies their confession. So we looked at in this pluralist modernity, it's always competing, it's more than just competing worldviews. We have competing forms of life which are teleological in nature, and we have a social embodied anthropology that is necessary to make sense of those forms of life. I think first notice that some of these, in some ways, is nothing new. When we look at pedagogies present in the early Christian church, we actually see a similarly holistic pedagogy that takes into account this social embodiment. In his book on the ancient Christian manual known as the Didache, Thomas O'Loughlin describes of catechumens that one had to learn how to live this new lifestyle, one had to be shaped and formed, one had to be gradually initiated into its values and activities, as well as its beliefs. So first, new adherents were socialized into a set of rituals, and then educated in the systems of belief which find their sense within those practices. And he describes the rituals as human signals that operate within societies at so basic a level of interpersonal communication, we are unconscious of them. And even that such signals are to a large extent beyond our rational control. Thus, a gesture that is a fixed part of a formal ritual may equally be a basic gesture that only takes on its formal aspect when used within that specific ritual. So a nod to a passing acquaintance on the street is a ritual action, yet the same notion of acknowledgement can take on a formal ritual form in a salute. Rituals are everywhere in life, not just in musty ceremonies frequented by those who like that sort of thing. Because they show us and those around us who we are and what are our most pressing concerns. Our rituals create the world we inhabit and call our culture. So any group who adopt a way of life will develop, whether they set out to or not, a set of rituals to give shape to that lifestyle. So basically, Smith's cultural analysis unmasks these alternative habituating forces as secular liturgies. And the implications for the church and Christian community is to develop an ancient and to use the liturgies of the church to create alternative liturgical habits and routines that both elucidate the telos of these secular liturgies, but ultimately challenge them and offer an alternative. So a holistic pedagogy that situates doctrine and theology within the habituated practices of the historic Christian church may cultivate a distinctive community through which the gospel of Jesus Christ can assume its visible embodiment in the world, such that it produces practical, concrete social transformation towards its eschatological vision of human flourishing and social justice. Thank you.
This is actually a discussion in line with the topic of the conference, looking at the logic of populism. So, to begin with, we cannot call something democracy when we like it and populism when we don't. So this is towards a theory of populism as a historical-cultural reason or logic, using the US as a case study, including evangelicals. I don't have a lot of slides. I only have a few slides for things that I think would be best captured visually. So I'm going to begin by saying that populism is often, yes, you warned me about this, sorry, that populism is often critiqued as an enemy of reason or logic, as a tribal violator of rational government. I'd like to suggest that populism is better understood as precisely an expression of the logic of the society in which it is embedded, notably the specific reasoning or thinking about society and government. This may include liberal ideas about society and government, as the conference title suggests, but it may include many other ways of thinking about society and government specific to each society. To understand why populism is persuasive, which is my goal here, the understanding, reasoning, or logic must be investigated, along with the conditions that prod particular readings of this underlying logic. I'll begin with a rubric that allows us to justify identifying a movement as populist, left, or right, and I'll range from stronger and weaker types. I will use populist right for the belief that society is economically and demographically changing in unwanted ways that can be fixed by protectionist trade and immigration policy. In the US, this is often accompanied by small governmentism. More of all this later, just for the definitions. Populist left, I am using marking as the belief that, once again, the economy is changing in unproductive ways but can be fixed by civil society and government efforts, including social services and programs to broaden access to resources and opportunities. So first to the rubric. Populism, left and right, is a way of presenting solutions. It's a way of presenting solutions to economic and way of life duress. Way of life duress refers to, way of life refers to a sense of threat to the way things should go down, to knowing what's fair, what's due you and due others, often prompted by demographic or other societal shifts such as changes in technology or gender roles. Economic duress, Economic duress may include poverty or current or underemployment, but also the sense that familiar paths to self-betterment are disappearing. Analyzing both 800 elections and 100 financial crises in 20 democracies since the 1870s, Funk et al. Found that, quote, financial crises put a strain on democracies. Far-right parties see strong political gains. The left also sees gains, as Adam Tooze notes in Crashed, How a Decade of Financial Crisis Changed the World. Populist solutions to economic or way of life duress aim at answering who is under unfair duress, why and how we have been wronged, and by whom. them. These questions are binary in form. Us does not mark any school, work, or church group, but the binary of my group in struggle against those who are unfairly doing us harm. Each one of those words is important. The degree of binarity locates a movement along a continuum from strong to soft populism. Degree of binarity depends on the possibilities for understanding them as nonetheless a worthy opposition in the vox populi, how inclusive we are of a variety of social groups or how narrow, and the essentialism of the us-them struggle. In order to feel right and be thought effective, no? What happened? Never mind. This is the fifth and important point. In order to feel right and be thought effective, populist solutions to economical way of life duress must be understandable. And while new ideas are not precluded from understandability, the most easily grasped solutions are often familiar. That is, a society's historical-cultural material, and we heard a lot about that from Hungary. The society's historical-cultural material grounds the pool of ideas, not that are populist, but from which populisms draw, specifically the ideas, once again, about government and society. So to the US as a case study. In addition to research on un- and underemployment, especially in old industry regions, in November of 2018, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that US life expectancy had declined for the third year in a row, mostly owing to deaths of despair, suicide, drug and overdose and alcoholism. While the US GDP grew at a rate of 3.5% in 2018, and income for the very lowest workers rose, nonetheless, rose as a result of employment and social assistance transfers. The smaller rise in income for working class and middle classes were far outstripped, these rises in income were far outstripped by rises in costs for healthcare, education, food, housing, etc., fostering both a current duress and again, this feared duress of the future. Looking at demographic or way of life threats, non-Hispanic whites will comprise less than 50% of the US population by 2044 and less than 50% of the American children by next year. White working class voters who fear that American culture is in danger from foreign influence or immigrant influence were 3.5 times more likely to prefer Donald Trump in the 2016 election and continue support for his policies regarding border wall. In proposing solution to these economic and way of life duresses, both left and right populisms propose an us and a them, but differ in their composition because they are drawing from different readings of America's cultural historical material regarding, again, society and government. The material most relevant to our topic today is Republican, covenantal, and liberal political theory. Now we will have the fastest review of Republican, covenantal, and liberal political theory ever known. In Republican and covenantal politics come to America through the Reformed centers. Being part of the nation entails commitment to the common good, and contributing to the republic is how persons achieve their fullest potential. Government is seen as emerging from the people for its benefit against the rich and politically ambitious. And as for them, John Winthrop in 1630 declared the care of the public must oversway all private respects. Liberalism sees the individual as freer to separate from the polis and governmental demands of government, to pursue individual opportunity. Now, this was a very persuasive idea in America as immigrants fled oppressive states. Their very flight reinforced the advantages of separability, of leaving, of separating from the polis. The harsh frontier boosted the advisability of self-reliance, trust in one's local community, and wariness of faraway federal authorities. Even as national government grew, American localism continued to foster a democratic critique of authority, state and locals policies that differed from each other across the political spectrum, right and left, and the robust civil society that Tocqueville so admired. I want to give an example of this from American left populism. Covenantal and Republican ideas, the government emerges from the Republic and from the covenanted community. These ideas about society and government are central in the pool of ideas, historical cultural material from which many left populisms draw. Them are identified as the wealthy who take an unfair share of societal resources and resist fair contribution to the common good. Us is relatively inclusive for race, immigration, status, and importantly, national government is part of the us, seen as emerging from the legitimate people and responsible for broad-based opportunity. There is clear binarity on the American left, but not strong binarity, where them is identified on alterable business positions, corporations that don't contribute enough to the common good, rather than on essentialist traits such as race. To illustrate, Sanders' soft left binarity, I have some comparisons to Hillary Clinton's more central policy positions. So you can see for Sanders, his them was Wall Street and the rich who unfairly resist contribution to the common good. And here you can see some of the how this played out in policy. Sanders wanted to increase taxes on Wall Street for free colleges. Clinton said no. She wanted to see an increase in private scholarships. Sanders wanted to tax speculative trading. Clinton says no. Sanders wanted to separate commercial banks from investment bank. Clinton says no. Sanders wanted to tax coal-powered and other fossil fuel. Clinton said no. And these reflect his greater binary on seeing certain economic interests in our society with as a slightly greater them than Clinton's more centrist position. Sanders supporters too, while not showing strong binarity, nevertheless showed greater binarity, this us-them, against the wealthy corporations, the insiders, than Clinton or Obama supporters. And this is consistent with their soft, but nevertheless more populist stance. Sanders supporters showed a more binary view of mainstream politics and economics. Let's move now to American right populism. The localist tradition, ideas about society and government, right? We're focusing on those two aspects of the historical cultural material. These are important again in the pool of ideas from which much right-wing populism draws, with its preference for civil society, the market, and local institutions. While this tradition has in many ways yielded much the best in America, under duress, present or feared, as people seek solutions in binary frameworks, local community becomes my community in struggle against them. This is a binarized reading of a very productive aspect of American life, of American commitment to community. Thus, commitment to community may become, under duress, the determination not only of my support of community, but that newcomers are threats to be constrained, and B, the historical wariness of oppressive government may become suspicion of government per se, whose activities should be limited except to implement the constraints against outsiders required by A. There is stronger and greater permanence of binarity, where them is identified on essentialist criteria such as race, or, interestingly, the non-locality of national government. That is, immigrants and minorities are seen as taking an unfair share of societal resources in crime or using social services, much as the populist left sees wealthy businesses as taking an unfair share of the national good. But because the new immigrant and government them for the populist right are identified on essentialist criteria, the binary is sharper and more enduring than it is if you identify an end of them based on alterable economic policies. A few examples quickly, beginning with gun ownership. So this will illustrate government as the them. Quote, an assault weapons ban, David French explains in the National Review, would gut the concept of an armed citizenry as the final bulwark against government tyranny. What's the reason for an assault weapons ban? We're going to protect ourselves from the tyrannical government. That's the bottom line. 3/4 of American gun owners associate gun ownership with freedom. Government wariness is also found in the opposition to federal social services, even among beneficiaries of those services, those who, under Republican plans to replace Obamacare, would have lost $5,000 in government subsidies for health insurance, voted for Trump. Those who would have lost $5,000 voted for Trump by 59 to 36 percentage points. As Applebaum and Gebeloff write in their research, these people are frustrated that they need help from the federal government. They feel guilty about taking it and resent government for providing it. Third, anxieties about new immigrants were equally or more decisive than economics and support for Trump among white working class voters, and continuous populist cause for support for the border wall. These anxieties hold, they are maintained, though immigrants spur business, increase employment, commit fewer crimes than native-borns, and though US faces at the moment a labor shortage at every single level of skill. While other Republicans propose pieces of a solution that keeps outsiders out, right? Who are the outsiders? National government, that's number one as an outsider, and then new immigrants and certain minorities. Trump gets at them all. His policies reduce government involvement in private health insurance, reduce government at all, overall, reduce government regulation of business, cut taxes, build a border wall, temporarily ban Muslims, impose tariffs on China, renegotiate on withdrawal from NAFTA, the TPP, and the Iran nuclear treaty. It's a perfect policy reflecting his expression of who them are. Trump's way of advancing, his rhetorical way of advancing these ideas, too, appeals to government and outsider wariness. In 2017, he described opening formally protected land to business development. And how did he describe it? As freeing America from government, and I quote, some people think that the national resources of Utah should be controlled by a small handful of bureaucrats in Washington, and they're wrong. Close quote. Both his policies and his rhetoric resonate with the 45% of Americans who say there is too much government regulation in business and industry. In short, Trump's solutions, right? Binaries present solutions to economic or way of life duress. Trump's solutions tap into long-standing right binary readings of what American government is, its suspect, and who American society is, the us. By long-standing, I mean that Republicans showed significant support for a border wall, not just immigration reform, a border wall, as much as 2 decades before Trump was even a candidate. Trump is doing what we call hunting where the ducks are. Now on to evangelicals. The 81% of evangelicals who voted for Trump and the 75% who remain his supporters argue for substantial affinity between his platform and evangelical beliefs. Caution, we have an enormous methodological problem with this. First, American evangelicals are Americans. Their voting and their politics may be motivated by any of the things already discussed: economic duress, way of life duress, etc. Present, feared, all the things already discussed. Yet, in surveys, checking the evangelical box at the top of the survey means that the survey takers attribute all other beliefs or political opinions to evangelical belief. Surveys are not equipped to do not factor out the motive behind other political or economic beliefs. I have a lot more material on the methodological problem should people want to discuss that or ask about it. So, what motivates evangelicals? As far as it seems that some evangelicals are motivated, adhere to right populism because of religious matters, opposition to abortion and gay marriage. But much is motivated also by economic and demographic duress. I suggest also that evangelical belief in small government solutions to these issues is a substantial factor in their voting belief. Wariness of government has very long and special traction among evangelicals for theological and religio-political reasons. First, as evangelical traditions place strong emphasis on personal covenant with God and among the covenanted community, they also emphasize the protection of the covenantal community from interfering forces. Second, as heirs of Europe's persecuted churches, Anabaptists, the dissenting and low reform churches, who had the you-know-what beat out of them by the official state churches, these immigrants to the United States developed, they actually came here with substantial sensitivity to tyrannical government. In an effort to build the New Jerusalem unmolested by the state and unbothered by non-believers, they followed the wisdom of relying on their trusted own communities and wariness of outsiders, be it potentially interfering, controlling, oppressive government, or simply other people unlike themselves. As this history and theology interacted with the rough conditions of American settlement and frontier, which also reinforced strong communities, evangelicals became the backbone of American society development in do-it-yourself, self-reliant localism. The largest government office in the antebellum period was the Postal Service. But by 1850, the churches, most of them evangelical, had doubled the employees, twice as many facilities, and raised 3 times as much money. They built everything. With post-bellum industrialization's urban poor, evangelicals continued their efforts in poor relief and society development, famously in the social gospel, which ran programs for the poor and provided America's first critique of laissez-faire capitalism. Evangelical socialism was strong into the 1930s. Okay. Thus, evangelical support for Republicans, or right populism, is not a Faustian bargain of evangelical votes in exchange for Republican cooperation on religious matters. That's not the deal. Rather, evangelicals, let's see what happens. Yes, evangelicals are drawn to their own beliefs in self-reliant republic unmolested by an overreaching government. A government that overreaches in taxes and regulations and in their resistance to other intruders to protect themselves. For example, they have been a consistent supporter of Grover Norquist's anti-tax position as a religious position. That's resistance to federal government. In 2004, that's 15 years ago, the legislative priority of the Christian coalition was to make Bush's tax cuts permanent. When Trump became the candidate, evangelicals supported him on the idea that personal flaws notwithstanding, we get it, God works through flawed people, we get it. He would bring about the best society in religious and extra-religious, economic and political arenas. Those for whom religious concerns are paramount have faith that Trump will move policy toward evangelical positions, which he has done. For instance, in issuing an executive ruling prohibiting federally funded health clinics from providing or giving information about abortions. Those evangelicals across the economic spectrum, from rich, and there are many, to poor, for whom economic matters are paramount, they have faith that the Trump tax cuts and regulation reductions will protect the economy from a hobbling government, as many other Republicans and non-evangelicals do. They're voting from their belief in small governmentism, born out of their historical wariness of central government. Those for whom underemployment and way of life I'm going to leave that there. Those for whom underemployment and way of life are paramount. The evangelicals who control the plumbing are really speaking up. I'm at my final sentence, so I'm going to prevail. Those for whom underemployment and way of life are paramount. These two directions we have been talking about have faith that tax cuts, reduction of regulations on business and finance, plus protectionist immigration and trade policy that's really annoying, will benefit the economy, like many non-evangelicals do, but that they will also protect the nation from the Latino threat, from Muslim terrorists and other interlopers. But note that this is best understood by exploring the long-standing reasoning of America about society, who's in and out, government, its size and composition, and the duresses today that prod binary readings of this long-standing logic. Thank you.
Today I'm going to talk about the political theology of neoliberal governance. It seems neoliberalism has become a magic word to explain why now democracy plays on the global scale. But researchers and thinkers, including Mark Beaver, argue it's necessary to pay attention to what can't be qualified by the framework that is neoliberalism in the current politics. However, even though it's better to keep in mind the fact that neoliberalism can theoretically, it's still crucial use to stick to and improve the analysis of neoliberalism, rather than try throwing the baby out. So the problem is how to refine the narratives of neoliberalism. And also is to introduce a particular perspective. To achieve this goal, this presentation develops as follows. First of all, we need to confirm the advantages and disadvantages of the Foucauldian governmental studies, which is believed to be one of the most practical frameworks on the subject. Then I move on to examine Agamben's critique of Foucault. George Agamben scrutinized and revised the Foucauldian narrative in his Kingdom and Theology, originally published in 2007. In a word, Agamben returns the Foucauldian narrative to the appropriate context, that is, theology. To my knowledge, Agamben is one of the first to deal with the problem of government in the scheme of political theology. However, it's crucial to distinguish the political theological analysis by Agamben from the anti-political theological project. That is because Agamben constructed the century messianism to abandon the eschatology of Schmidt. Thus, it's imperative to seek alternatives to the Agambenian formula. This presentation is gonna conclude by proposing an alternate interpretation of what alternative left. And by this presentation owes much to the recent pioneering work by Adam Coxwell on neoliberalism demons, published last year, so this presentation intends to bolster the study rather than refute. Foucault hasn't played an essential role in various areas. His concept of biopolitics is revolutionary in this sense. However, many researchers have been fascinated for the last decades by his concept of governmentality. What is governmentality? Firstly, Firstly, Foucault defined governmentality as a whole process aiming at population, not people, by calculation, tactics, analysis, and so on. Secondly, he describes it as a tendency in which governance becomes superior to the forms of power such as sovereignty and discipline in his understanding. And Foucault began his study of governmentality in his lecture at College of France in 1978. The title is Security, Territory, Population, and that it's in his lecture in 1979, the birth of biopolitics, that Foucault develops his study and ventures on the analysis of neoliberalism in governmental perspective. Foucault situates the origin of neoliberalism in the thought of order liberalism, which was initiated by Dr. Eugen and developed by the Freiburg School. Foucault points out order liberalism and its forwards are contrary to the classical liberalism in that it accentuates the importance of the competition in the market, which subjugates legal order to the market. While the classical liberalism considered the foundation of the market as exchanges between free men, Foucault expands his analysis into the sort of Chicago School American version of neoliberalism and the emergence from economics through tracing theory and the theory of human capital. However, it's a fact. The Foucauldian perspective on neoliberalism has become already one of the mainstream. For instance, the Sage Handbook of Neoliberalism, published last year, lists the Foucauldian approach as one of the most useful frameworks. As another example, Wendy Brown, in her award-winning work Undoing the Demos, demonstrates how the Foucauldian approach could be applied to the analysis of neoliberalism. She rightly points out the difficulty and ambiguity of Foucault's lecture in 1979, which results from internal and external reasons, such as Foucault's anti-Marxism and so on. However, it's worth questioning if these understandings do justice to what's at stake in the goal of Foucault. To understand it, it's beneficial to point out discrepancies in the acceptance and reception of Foucault. For one thing, some researchers observed Foucault might have expected neoliberalism to work in a favorable way. For instance, Serge Audier called attention to the fact there is a contextual difference between during the 1970s and today. As he said, Foucault approves of neoliberalism in that it's an alternative to the economic interventionism such as totalitarianism, planned economy, and Keynesianism, with the aim of achieving not govern too much, securing the freedom. Also, it's plausible Foucault considered neoliberalism as an alternative for Marxism at the time of the emergence of the non-Marxist second left. But more important, some researchers who have worked on the sort of Foucault for decades, such as Michelin and Michael C. Beeren, suggest Foucault is positive on neoliberalism in terms of his theoretical transition. Foucault already started to reconstruct his famous formula on power discipline in his lecture in 1976, Society Must Be Defended, and The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, published in the same year. Briefly, he changed his view of power from the binary structure of the penal law and discipline to the triad law, discipline, and governance. That is because Foucault already observed the emergence of new form of power at this time, and on the other hand, Foucault forebode it's possible to construct a space of freedom from governmentality, which is a departure from the society penetrated by the disciplinary power perspective. In a word, the Foucauldian definition of neoliberalism is not a mere economic policy, but a worldview which is political and ontological, concerning freedom. Not a few thinkers have used Foucault to think against neoliberalism without fathoming his thought. In this sense, again, they propose an insightful question. In Homo Cycle, again, they combine the Schmittian concept of sovereignty with biopolitics and reinterpreted the legal political foundation of Western politics. In that work, Agamben simply failed to consider governmentality, while in the Kingdom the Glory he ventured on it and attempts to criticize Foucault. Agamben accuses Foucault failing to consider the theological aspect of governance. His claim seems legitimate. Foucault insecurity, territory, population, states, pastoral power, the original form of governmental power derived from ancient Orient, not ancient Greece and Rome. Foucault even adds, governance in this sense did not figure except in Christianity until the emergence of the polis state. Although Foucault warns the three forms of power, that is law, discipline, governance, coexist to some degree. To some degrees, he has been oscillating on the levels of abstractness through his lectures. That Foucault tells us if sovereignty and governance appear separately and has a different substance. In contrast, Agamben sheds new light on the relationship between sovereignty and governance by supplementing, providing the discussions about the Trinitarian dogma, which means governance has existed throughout the Western history, contrary to the Orientalist account of Foucault. By tracing the economic theology through reconciling Aristotle to Thomas Aquinas, Agamben succeeds in modifying Foucault in that Agamben he shows how sovereignty and governance have an intrinsic link. Even though in his lecture Foucault deals with the German politician Ludwig Erhard, who pointed out the necessity of reconstructing the relationship between sovereign states and market for the neoliberal competition to work. In spite of that, Foucault ignores sovereignty in governance when tackling neoliberalism in general. The bailout provided by the governments of the countries in the financial crisis is a good example which shows how deep several states and big companies are able to be independent competitors in market are connected in reality, in practice. However, there is also a problem in the thought of Agamben. Although Agamben improves the Foucauldian schema and provides a practical framework, he complicates the problems. That is only because he relies on the political messianism as a solution, which we could classify in comparison with the eschatology of Schmitt. The Catechon, the Restrainer, appears in the second letter to Thessalonians and plays a vital role in the thought of Schmitt. Schmitt expresses his genuine faith in the eschatology as early as in Theodor novel published in 1916, and even declares the Catechon as the only possible way of bridging the gap between the eschatology and secular history in the notes of the earth. It's possibly Schmitt considers this eschatological catechonic worldview as the foundation of secular politics. And against this, Agamben depends on the messianism which is constructed through reading Benjamin, Jacob, Hadas, and a variety of materials. In a word, Agamben always presupposes this politically implausible messianism. That is why it's indispensable to seek alternatives. To sum it up, contrary to the general trend, the Foucauldian analysis of neoliberalism contains more than economic policy. Foucault understands governmentality as a political and ontological worldview and explores it in search of a space of freedom. Agamben revises the Foucauldian discourses and arrives at the essential relationship between sovereignty and governance by dealing with economic theology. However, at the same time, Agamben presumes full-fledged messianism as an answer which is supposed to challenge its Jungian eschatology. Seemingly, we need to seek an alternative to these extreme positions. Maybe it's a revising model of secularism, or maybe it's religious particularism, or the debate goes on secularism.
Great. actually have 13 minutes to, yeah, I don't know if Mary's here, what the straight up on that was my next question. So we can, panelists want to come back up?
We have half an hour to go.
Yeah, I know, forgot. You want to come back up and get our questions? Okay. So, questions? David?
Sorry.
So I have a question for Austin.
Yes.
I really appreciate your presentation in the way that you emphasize action as a counter to belief. I'm wondering about how, I mean, kind of it matches up in my mind to this notion that Schmidt has of the decision as something that's has to be an action. It's not just shaped by an interpretation of text, but it has to be an action. Right? And I think in my mind, I link it up with Hannah Arendt's notion of freedom as something that only occurs through action. Right? But in your description of that, in referring to Wittgenstein, what I was a little bit unsure about was the way in which you're setting up this pre-linguistic realm as something that's just like purely the body, right? Because that's kind of, you cited McIntyre on that. And because I think that there really is a difference between a kind of animal body and a human body. And the key difference is really in kind of the, I guess, in the human body, it's already from the very beginning kind of linguistically shaped, it says, as something that has a different kind of teleology than animal bodies. And animal bodies, yes, they're shaped by teleology, but it's a teleology of basically of survival and reproduction. And that's all they get in terms of teleology. But clearly human bodies are shaped by other forms of teleology, precisely the type of teleology you get from like a religious tradition. And so, and that has to be, it's part of the habits that have developed. So even those supposedly pre-linguistic habits are already, in fact, linguistically preformed into habits that have a kind of teleology that's alternative to the theology of an animal body, right? And so that's why I think we have to think through that relationship between action and belief in a more, I guess, maybe dialectical way, and think through, it's not just an opposition between ideas and actions. It really, I think there's this third aspect, which is figures, metaphors, essentially. I referred to before as aesthetics, right? But it's these kinds of figures that I think that really then are what are at work in this kind of shaping. Because figures are in rituals, are in language as well, but it's maybe a more general term for this type of shaping that's already going on. That's the kind of question I'm wondering if you can think through that. I don't know. I had a question for Marcia too, but we can get to that.
Yeah, I mean, McIntyre argues that we should think of dolphins, for example, as pre-linguistic, not non-linguistic.
Oh.
So to the way they communicate, that they do things for fun, seeming like they do activities outside of just survival in a way that is communal and in a way that reflects a lot of human activities and human behavior beyond these kind of really simple reproduce, survive ways of thinking. And so he's kind of arguing we shouldn't actually attribute that to animals quite in the way we do, and that we should see those animals as being pre-linguistic in the same way that young children are pre-linguistic. And so there's some continuity of behavior there that we should see it motivating that behavior and the engagement there. So they don't have the same kind of reflective capacities humans have, but they have some of the same kind of communal elements of play and cooperation and those kinds of things. So there is this sort of reflective element, and this is where Wittgenstein comes in, is when children are first learning these things, they're just learning these really basic judgments that aren't linguistic. They don't really get the concepts or ideas yet, they just know, do that, don't do that, right? So there's very basic judgments about the world. Later they can start to question, well, why shouldn't I do that? But initially everything, ethical, aesthetic, is all just approval and disapproval, essentially. And so it's like this really basic level of behave this way, don't behave that way. And then over time, acquire the reflective capacity to then evaluate those habits and behaviors.
I actually would like to just say something very short to this question on this. From my reading in evolutionary biology, which are talking about sort of what is the constitutive relationship between language and action. And from an evolutionary perspective, it's a mutually constitutive evolution over about 1.5 million years, where communication emerges from what Girard called mimesis, but you don't have to be a Girardian. Which is highlighted by we have very long, vulnerable childhoods requiring extended relationship between older humans and baby humans and toddler humans. And in this long, protracted period, there's a great deal in pre-language, not Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, whatever they were before they were Homo, all the phases. I don't want to go through the linguistic line. There's exchange, copying, mimesis, and exchange of gesture and facial expression. Now, these are actions. That is a precondition, this exchange of action, copying gestures, copying facial expressions, is an exchange of actions that is part of the development of the capacity for what we call now language. So so there's not that we have actions and over here we have language, but in fact the very development of our language emerged from our particular human development out of actions. So they're much more intertwined, which I think speaks to your concern that they're much more intertwined even as a matter of evolution.
I'm going to add something too on this, from a slightly different perspective, that if you think of McIntyre as trying to get somewhere in between kind of materialist evolutionary view in which we are largely mechanical in some way or another, and Neoplatonic view in which our bodies have virtually no importance. And he's trying to find a place where we can say that our bodies are significant in terms of action, and that our whole selves are unified in terms of body and soul, and that then we can be articulate in our spiritual nature, in our actions, in our physical actions. I think that we can say, we'll leave the dolphins aside for a moment. I mean, I'm happy to leave the dolphins aside and worry about whether I'm a vegetarian or a dolphin eater. Not a dolphin eater, don't worry. And say, but what he's trying to get at, I think, is something that you're not going to object to, which is this idea that as embodied creatures with an evolutionary history, we actually have the capacity that is pre-linguistic, proto-linguistic, potential linguistic, that is partly physical as well as medical.
I need to respond to that because I think that we really need to hold on to a very important categorical distinction here, and it's rooted in Peirce's distinction between a kind of relationship that's based on an index and one that's based on a symbol, right? Now, animal communication is entirely based on indexical signs, right? Which is to say that we can talk about it, right? But it entirely is. It really is because their evolution is based on the process of natural selection, and natural selection is a process of indexical signs because if something changes in the environment that pushes in a certain direction, that's going to change the animal behavior or the animal, the different characteristics. That's an indexical relationship. It's a correspondence in fact. Now, the beginning of humans is probably with Australopithecus, right? Because Australopithecus was this period, sort of, between 3 and 2 million years ago, right? Where there must have been an initial type of very basic symbolic sign usage, which I think, the best argument I think is Karen Deacon's argument that the very first use of symbols, right, was not a communicative type, but really was probably an ordering of gender relationships, like of kinship relations, in which you might have had Australopithecines which had already a kind of instinctual mode of sort of gender relationships, right? But then was, in a sense, there was some bright, probably Australopithecine female, right, that all of a sudden imposed upon her progeny a kind of a sign, which must have been something like that, like a mark on their forehead to say, look, you're part of this group, and you're going to have to leave. This is the males, but they just have to leave, right? And that already is a first sign in a very basic symbolic system. And what's important about a symbolic system is that the signs don't refer to things in the world, but they refer to other signs.
Right.
And once you have that, you've got two signs and one rule, and that's grammar. Right? And so animals don't do that. There are no animals that have signs that relate to other signs. And so that's the threshold. And once you have that, then you've got a whole different process of habit and behavior. So,
right. So I don't know, we don't want to necessarily take the whole question period to develop, but just to respond. First of all, this happens in stages, not necessarily one person having life. But there's something more important. But I didn't fully express it before. What's meant by mimesis, why copying gesture and copying facial expression is not indexical in the way you've just described it, because it creates the copying. It also creates the ability for proto-language, tool making, transfer of complex information, and eventually, about 1 million years ago, the ability to reenact past events, this is entirely symbolic, and to project events into the future. And once you have these, you have the conditions for proto-language. And there are some wonderful people, Sarah Hurdy and Donald Márton and many, many others about this. If you're interested in reading, I'd be happy just to give you a few citations. But this long development from gesture that is indexical, by your definition, to exchange of facial expression and gestures right before language that is not indexical, which is symbolic, because it is enabling communication, not about the thing in front of you. You can't communicate how to make a tool in general if you can only communicate how to hit this rock on this thing now. If you can't communicate that if you always hit this rock on this thing, you will get an arrowhead, you can't teach people how to make tools into the future. So there's this long period where, in fact, this mimicking of gesture and mimicking of facial expressions precedes what we call now full-fledged language. But what it allows for is the preconditions of language, including the reenactment of past events, the ability to repeat present events in the future, but also to project into the future things that haven't yet happened. And that's what with the literature on mimesis and gesture and communication and language talks about integratively.
Okay, so I think we had a couple other questions here, and then Pekka.
So while we're on signs, symbols, and gender, I have a question for Edward about money. You mentioned that you think that people don't need to use money to participate in great exchange, and cited domestic care, which often goes uncompensated, as one example. But I would ask first whether you think that that is participation in the great exchange, or rather mediated participation through one player, namely the husband. And if you would say that it is, I would ask how you would feel about the practice recently described by an anthropologist in the book Primates of Park Avenue, wherein high-earning men pay their stay-at-home wives a so-called wife bonus, which, on the one hand, compensates them for labor that we usually balk at the idea of compensating, but on the other hand, does enable them, therefore, to then participate in the great exchange more broadly.
Okay.
The Great Exchange, and I wasn't clear about this, so thank you for the question. I wasn't clear, I hope because of reasons of time, but not because of reasons of obscurity of my mind. That, everyone participates in the Great Exchange. Caring labor is, labors of love are not only, there are various aspects of them in the human condition, but one of the aspects is the economic aspect of a gift of self, a gift of your labor, your skills, your time, to humanize the world, in particular to make your house clean. Well, probably the primates of Park Avenue have someone else to make their house clean, but to take care of your child, and so forth. And so they're definitely part of the Great Exchange, and in most cultures traditionally, well, let's say up to quite recently, it was pretty much normal that there was this model of a breadwinner and a housewife, and they were both laboring. One was laboring for pay, and one was laboring at domestic labor. And then the money system was used to make sure that the things you needed to buy money were available to the family. So the money system was not, as it were, it was sexist if you want, because the women in this standard model didn't actually earn money, but it was, as I always say about money, it was convenient because it allowed the things that you needed to buy that were made for money to be paid for by money, and then they were distributed. So a wife, I mean, I'm a little bit puzzled by the wife paying. There used to be a husband paying system in lower middle class or lower class families in England because the husbands would drink so much, the wife would collect the money and give her husband an allowance. And that also is very similar, is that you share the money and you share the labor, and sometimes you allocate a certain portion of money to one party or the other, because in the money part of this great economy, the great exchange, there's certain things you need to buy, and it may be the husband wants to buy his booze, or the wife needs to buy the shopping. Again, when I imagine some Park Avenue, someone else takes care of all of those things. But I presume, I guess she buys lunch with her friends. That would be what the wife does. Buys daycare, whatever. So it's there, but the Great Exchange continues. And whether it's sexist or unfair is because we value money. Money that has a sociological importance that is not really there in the real economy. The real economy is this labor and consumption. We put a sociological scale of values on different kinds of labor. One of the ways we identify that is by people being paid having a higher sociological value than people who are not paid for their labor. And that's an interesting phenomenon. It used to be that people who didn't get paid, aristocrats, had the highest value for their labor. We've shifted that around. There's nothing inherent in money that makes it high value. It's just a social judgment.
Okay, we have 10 minutes left. Stop at 11:15. Tucker.
Wonderful set of papers. I'd like to ask questions to all of the presenters, but this goes to Edward also to continue this. Anthropology of money is a wonderful field of study and can explain not only what people believe about money and the relationships that are connected to money, but also the behavior. For example, money given to people or money found or somehow gotten free, like a winning in a gamble, seems to be behaviorally less valuable than money earned by labor and so on. These kinds of things are real. But then how do you include in your classification of the functions of money the fact that money can also serve as a medium of exploitation? For example, in gambling, it's a huge transfer of money from the poor to the rich, or the quick unsecured loan business, or in fact the global financial economy as such is a system of exploitation where money is key. you can't do it without money. So money has not only value in the sociological, anthropological, or semiotic sense, but it has real value. Someone had worked sometime, some way, to give value to this sum of money that is taken away from a worker who was gathered.
Okay, that's a complicated question in a way. I will try and answer it pretty directly. Well, in a way, it's a very simple question. Money as a tool for rewarding labor and as a tool for paying for consumption is, as it were, the ontological center of what we use money for. And then we do other things, partly because we have these other kinds of money, savings money or treasure money, that we move around. And partly in gambling is at the edge of my explanatory model, but it's a kind of wage of a sort that is, it does take us into a different symbolic realm than the basic economic realm. So it's a sociological relationship rather than an economic relationship. And so it is a place where my model is a little bit uncomfortable, I will say. And that is there. Now, I have a whole lot to say about finance, and gambling really fits into this model, into this part of the model. And finance, like gambling, is basically a way to take money from the poor and give it to the rich. It's a sort of tribute. In economics, you talk about rent. It's an economic rent, and that's a sociological relationship that does often take place with token money, part of it, and that's relevant to this. And so it has a kind of non-economic, it's a little bit outside of the Great Exchange in its logic. But as I said, and I didn't really say it very much in this very short form, a lot of the things that we have money numbers for, the prices, the wages, the income you get as a, say, recipient of the income from gambling, not the winnings, but the recipient, the intermediary who takes most of the money in the long run. They may not be obviously connected to the labor you do. There's a kind of fluidity in parts of this, and that's a little bit, makes the whole thing a little more complicated. But what I want to do in talking about it is to get at the core of this idea of money, which is this tool in the Great Exchange. And then there are these sociological overlays that are very important. But I want to look at the sociology and not at the money, because I think sociology is much more important. And the symbols that money have are also very important. And then to try and separate that out from the actual practice of the labor and consumption in the economy, because I think it's a different part of human nature than our arrangements of society.
So I have a question for Marcia. I'm just kind of giving my kind of sort of a brief overview of my perceptions of the religious right, starting in 2008, which is that, of course, when the Democrats finally took the White House, there seemed to be all this soul-searching that the religious right had failed, and that they should withdraw from politics. Right? If you look at Rod Dreher's blog, right? I mean, he's like, full of this stuff, right? I mean, that that Christianity no longer has any kind of grounding in American society, right? And there's this moment of real retreat, right? It seemed like the religious right had actually had become basically a spent force, right? With many of its leaders saying, well, we should actually reflect on ourselves. But then, of course, like 8 years later, it seems now to have, if you look at mass media, establishment media, to have stormed back and is now the kind of the major, like social power, right? And the more paranoid version of it, of course, is that, oh, well, these are the forces that are leading us to some kind of, fascism or whatever. And I'm wondering, how do you account for this kind of vast swing? Right. I mean, and is this and what is the reality? Right. I mean, is it that sometimes that forces that are weak, can be really inflated in the media, or is there some kind of underlying strength did the religious right somehow rediscover some kind of magic formula, right, whereby it's stormed back into power, or is this all just a series of weird accidents and misunderstandings in which people are I don't know, like overreacting, right, to what's happening in the U.S.
Thank you for the question. I'm selling vials of that magic formula after the conference. So first of all, be very wary of what you read in the mainstream media of evangelicals, because sensationalist stories get printed, and a great deal of other research and reality on the ground does not get printed because it doesn't sell papers or websites or whatever the medium is. American evangelicals are Americans. And they have fluctuations. There's one of two parts answer to your question. One is that there are fluctuations in evangelical behavior in the same way that there are fluctuations in American behavior. There was a move to the Democratic Party and something like left or center left or something in 2008 with Obama. The country moved there and evangelicals moved there. For example, well over a third of evangelicals under 40, that's not the youth vote, right? By the time you're in your 30s and 40s, you have kids, you have mortgages, whatever, you have, orthodontia bills and so on. Over a third of evangelicals under 40 in 2008 voted for Obama. So there was a move in 2008 in the evangelical community in the way the rest of the country was moving. So they are evangelicals, like most people, are not governed by one factor. And if you'd like, we can talk more about the methodological issues there in in conducting surveys and so on. And then as the country moves right, you would expect evangelicals, like every other demographic group in this country, not every other, many demographic groups, including that big swing vote center, to which now more people belong to the independent swing vote that belong to either Democrat or Republican loyalists, so to speak. So there's going to be an uptick when the rest of the country moves right, for example, to an uptick among evangelicals to move right. So that phenomenon is frankly unremarkable. So there's the media part of it, there's the evangelicals move as America moves. But the third part is that there is a very serious minority of evangelicals, outspoken, intelligent, and with lots of media outlets, who are gravely and seriously anti-Trump and are critiquing their fellow brothers and sisters in Christ for their adhesion to right populist positions, Republican economic positions, and in particular to Trump. So this is about 25% didn't vote for Trump, and even now are even more vociferously opposed to Trump than they were in 2016 because they see actually the policies were alignment. And one doesn't have to be a very sophisticated evangelical to understand that Trump's policies are not reflecting being the hands and feet of Jesus. So that's kind of right.
So 25%?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to ask, Hungary, would you say there's 25% of the Christian community that would be anti-Orban?
Yeah. Or more than.
More than that, yeah.
Oh, I didn't mean 25% of Christians. I meant all Christians. That's 25% of white evangelicals, not of all Christians. That's a different statistic.
Fair enough.
So we've got all those three things going on.
I just wanted to make a quick comment about the change of the culture, because I think, since 2000, like the main image of evangelical in American popular culture was Ned Flanders, right, from Simpsons. But somehow that image has been displaced by The Handmaid's Tale. Right, so it seems to me that if we want to have a realistic depiction of, of today's world, we would have to have Ned Flanders in The Handmaid's Tale. As, patriarch, right?
You know, that it's been my argument since I started doing field work on evangelicals, which is 15 years ago or something, 13, 14 years ago, is that what's going on the ground is mostly not in the mainstream media. The good news is there's a little bit more, not a lot, but a little bit more reflection of the variation of evangelical practice and belief, white evangelical practice and belief in the mainstream media. You will get people like Amy Sullivan or other people in the Washington Post and so on writing about their dismay at the evangelical right. You will get not only Randall Balmer, but Greg Boyd and Tree Robinson and Joel Hunter and many, Tony Campolo, Shane Claiborne, who's a pop star of the white evangelical youth, and many, many others who are very publicly critiquing, protesting against the evangelical right. So that's also going on. And we are now, when I started my field research, and even when my book came out in 11, there was no visibility of this in the mainstream media. Now, if you look, you can find a little.
Okay, let's thank the panelists.